Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of truth and depth, welcome. Today, we embark upon a descent not into darkness, but into the concealed chambers of the human psyche, into the part of ourselves that has been long exiled, ignored, and misunderstood, the part we deny, suppress, and fear. Carl Jung called this realm the shadow, and until we confront it, it will control our lives from the dark. The shadow is not just our rage, envy, or shame. It is also our unlived life, our buried potential, our authentic voice that was once silenced by culture, trauma, or fear of rejection. Jung reminds us that the shadow, though hidden, is not evil in itself. What is dangerous is our refusal to acknowledge it. For what we do not face within, we project onto the world without turning friends into enemies, difference into threat, and inner turmoil into outer chaos. In this lecture, we're not just discussing psychology, we are engaging with the spiritual. Confrontation. You'll be challenged not only to think, but to feel, to remember, to witness the masks you wear and the truths you've buried. Because real wholeness, true individuation, cannot happen until you face the very parts of yourself you wish didn't exist. So I ask you not to listen passively, but to lean in courageously, because to look into your shadow is not weakness, it is the beginning of self-mastery. And in the words of Jung himself, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Let us begin. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche is not a neatly organized domain of conscious thoughts and noble intentions. It is a complex and often chaotic interplay of light and darkness, and at the heart of this internal duality is something he called the shadow. The shadow is everything within us that we have chosen not to see. It is not simply the repository of our evil thoughts or socially unacceptable urges, though those may be part of it. The shadow includes all that we reject, deny, or suppress within ourselves: our jealousy, our rage, our desires, but also our vulnerability, our pain, our creative instincts, and even our deepest yearnings. It is the parts of our psyche that we have disowned, often under pressure from society, family, religion, or trauma. Jung warned that what we refuse to face within ourselves does not disappear. Instead, it sinks into the unconscious and begins to rule us from the shadows. Many people imagine they are fully aware of who they are. They believe that because they can describe their personality, articulate their beliefs, and identify their preferences, they are entirely self-aware. But Jung suggested otherwise. According to him, self-awareness without shadow awareness is a dangerous illusion. In reality, the psyche is layered, and much of what motivates our actions, our defensiveness, our judgments, our attractions, and our repulsions comes from the shadow. And yet, because it operates in the unconscious, we often have no idea that these internal dynamics are even happening. The more we resist acknowledging our shadow, the more power it gains. It is the unseen engine behind many of our most destructive behaviors. This is the reason Jung stressed that the shadow must be faced, not analyzed from a safe intellectual distance, not judged or moralized, but genuinely confronted. The first step to facing the shadow is recognizing that it exists not as an abstract psychological concept, but as a living reality within each of us. Most people don't want to admit they carry rage or envy, that they harbor resentment or bitterness, that they fantasize about revenge, that they feel superior or inferior to others in unhealthy ways. So they lie to themselves. They create a socially acceptable persona that denies these feelings and covers them up with niceness, religious righteousness, or false humility. But the truth is, pretending not to have a shadow only ensures that it will dominate your life in unseen ways. What you refuse to own about yourself gets projected onto other people. You will hate in others what you refuse to see in yourself. You will fight the world instead of confronting your own heart. Jung observed this not just in individuals, but in cultures, religions, and political systems. Whenever a society refuses to own its collective shadow, it begins to persecute, scapegoat, or demonize others. The personal shadow and the collective shadow feed each other. Entire wars have been fought because the people refused to confront their shadow, and instead labeled another group as evil, dangerous, or inferior. And yet, this starts at the individual level. It begins when a person suppresses his own fears, lusts, doubts, and rage, because he's been told those things are unacceptable. He then pretends to be free from these darker tendencies, but instead of being free, he becomes possessed by them. In denying his shadow, he becomes blind to it, and what is blind in us becomes compulsive. We act out the very thing we claim to hate, and we don't even see it happening. One of Jung's most powerful ideas was that the shadow is not simply a moral flaw or a psychological inconvenience. It is a vital part of the self. It contains enormous amounts of energy, vitality, and even wisdom. That's why he believed that to become whole, to truly individuate, we must reintegrate the shadow into consciousness. This does not mean indulging the worst parts of ourselves, nor does it mean justifying harmful behavior. It means recognizing the fullness of who we are, including the parts we wish weren't there, and learning how to work with them rather than repress them. In doing so, we begin to reclaim the parts of our soul we abandoned in the name of being good or acceptable. The process of confronting the shadow is not comfortable. It requires courage, humility, and radical honesty. It forces us to face the reality that we are not always the heroes of our own story. We are sometimes the villains, the saboteurs, the cowards, the manipulators, but Jung did not teach this to shame us. He taught this so we could be free. True liberation does not come from pretending we are pure. It comes from knowing we are complex and choosing to walk in truth anyway. When we face our shadow, we begin to see how it has shaped our relationships, our choices, and even our spirituality. We notice how we blame others for what we can't face in ourselves. We see how our patterns repeat because the parts of ourselves that need healing are still in hiding. The shadow also contains suppressed gifts. Many people hide their creativity because they were told it was silly. Others suppress leadership abilities because they fear being seen. Some bury their assertiveness because they associate it with aggression. When the shadow is only seen as negative, we lose the opportunity to reclaim these lost treasures. But when we begin to approach it with curiosity rather than fear, we discover that the very qualities we feared might destroy us are actually the key to our transformation. The shadow holds not just our wounds, but our medicine, not just our shame, but our authenticity. Jung's message was not to run from the shadow, but to walk into it with eyes open, because only by facing the shadow can we stop it from controlling us. Only by shining light into the unconscious can we stop projecting our pain onto the world, and only by embracing the fullness of our humanity can we begin the journey toward psychological integration and spiritual maturity. The shadow is not your enemy, it is the part of you that wants to come home. And until you acknowledge its presence, you will never fully know who you are. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." In this single sentence lies the profound truth about projection, one of the most powerful mechanisms of the human psyche and one of the clearest paths by which the shadow expresses itself. Projection is the process through which we unconsciously place parts of ourselves, especially the parts we have rejected or disowned, onto others. We perceive in them what we have failed to acknowledge in ourselves. This doesn't happen because we're dishonest or malicious, but because the human mind, in its effort to maintain a coherent self-image, will hide from what it cannot bear to see. What we reject internally, we externalize, often with great conviction, judging others for what we deny within. The shadow operates most visibly in the moments when we feel disproportionate emotional reactions to people or situations. When a person deeply offends, annoys, or triggers you, there's a high chance that what you're reacting to is not just them, it's your own shadow being reflected back at you. If someone's arrogance enrages you beyond reason, it might be because you have denied your own hunger for recognition. If someone's confidence bothers you, it could be because you have buried your own sense of self-worth. If someone's freedom makes you feel angry, it might be because you have imprisoned yourself with limitations you've come to accept. Jung taught that the outer world is often a mirror of the inner world, not a literal reflection, but a symbolic one, echoing back to us the qualities and conflicts we have not integrated. This is where personal transformation begins, when we learn to look at our emotional reactions not as evidence of others' faults, but as signals pointing towards something unresolved within. Projection is not just about negative emotions, either. Sometimes we project our highest qualities, our brilliance, power, or creativity onto others, especially those we admire. We see greatness in others and believe we are small in comparison. We worship, rather than realize that we are seeing a reflection of our own dormant potential. Jung called this positive projection, and it too is a distortion, because it displaces our own light onto someone else's stage. Whether the projection is positive or negative, the result is the same. We become disconnected from our true selves, and we live in a world of illusions, judging, admiring, fearing, and resenting others for things we have not yet accepted in ourselves. Projection often begins in childhood, when we first encounter messages about what parts of us are acceptable and what parts are not. If a child is told they are too emotional, they may begin to suppress their sensitivity and later criticize others for being too dramatic. If a child is punished for asserting themselves, they may grow up to despise authority or fear leadership. These buried emotions and traits don't vanish, they go underground, into the unconscious, and begin to operate from there. They then reappear in our adult relationships, especially in our closest bonds, romantic relationships, friendships, and even workplace dynamics become the arenas in which our shadow plays out through projection. We believe our anger about them. We believe our jealousy about them. But often, it is about a fracture within us, a part that longs to be seen, healed, and brought back into conscious awareness. Projection is not just psychological, it becomes deeply spiritual. When we live in a state of projection, we are not seeing reality, we are seeing our shadow layered over reality. Our judgments become veils, distorting our vision, leading us away from empathy, clarity, and truth. We think we are perceiving the world as it is, but in fact, we are only seeing the world as we are. That is why the path of shadow work is so radical. It calls us to stop blaming and start reflecting, to pause when triggered and ask, what part of me have I disowned that is being activated right now? What do I need to own in myself so I can stop placing it on others? Jung believed that the integration of the shadow was essential not only for personal peace, but for the peace of humanity. A world full of people who project their darkness onto others will always be at war internally and externally. We see it in politics, where opponents are demonized instead of understood. We see it in religion, where those who believe differently are labeled heretics or threats. We see it in racism, sexism, and all forms of prejudice, where entire groups become scapegoats for an individual or collective shadow. The refusal to take ownership of our darkness fuels cycles of division and hate. The work of dismantling projection is, therefore, not just a personal task, but a moral and social responsibility. The more each person becomes aware of their projections, the less likely they are to wound others in unconscious ways. Shadow work is not about perfection. It's about honesty. When we begin to reclaim our projections, we do not instantly become saints, but we begin to live more authentically. We can have disagreements without demonization. We can feel anger without blame. We can appreciate others without placing them on pedestals. We become able to say, "This is mine. This is not about you." And in that clarity, relationships can deepen. Love can become more real. Conflict can become a path to insight rather than destruction. Jung did not suggest that the shadow be eradicated, but that it be acknowledged, befriended, and integrated. The process of identifying projection often begins with discomfort. It requires paying attention to the moments that provoke shame, defensiveness, or judgment. When someone's behavior strikes a nerve, it is useful to ask, "What does this say about me?" Not in a self-blaming way, but in a curious and compassionate way. When we can admit, "I see in them what I fear in myself," or "I envy what I have yet to claim," the shadow begins to lose its grip. Awareness melts illusion. Over time, the gap between who we are and who we think we are begins to close. We become more whole not because we have removed all darkness, but because we have learned to see it, own it, and work with it instead of pretending it isn't there. Projection can also become an incredible tool for growth. Every irritation, every jealousy, every sudden emotional charge becomes an invitation to go inward. Instead of reacting outwardly, we begin to listen inwardly. The very traits we hate in others may be qualities we need to understand or develop within ourselves. The criticism we heap on others may reveal a standard we are afraid to apply to ourselves. Even our heroes can teach us what we are meant to become if we are willing to reclaim the golden light we have cast upon them. Every projection holds a hidden truth, a mirror to something within, waiting to be integrated. And until we learn to read these mirrors with wisdom, we will remain trapped in cycles of blame and illusion, repeating the same patterns, facing the same conflicts, never realizing that the source of our suffering is not outside, but within. Carl Jung warned that what we suppress does not disappear, it festers. It transforms, it deepens into something more dangerous, something more subtle. The psyche is not a vault we can lock and walk away from. It is a living, breathing ecosystem, and when we suppress emotions, desires, or parts of our personality that we don't want to face, we create internal pressure. The more we try to keep certain thoughts and feelings out of consciousness, the more they gather energy below the surface. This is the root of repression, and repression over time becomes a form of internal poison. It is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The more we press it down, the more forcefully will eventually rise. Repression begins innocently. A child is scolded for crying and learns that vulnerability is dangerous. Another child is punished for showing anger and learns to smile through pain. Someone is told that wanting too much is selfish, so they shut down their desires. These early moments of rejection are often not remembered in detail, but they leave a deep imprint. The psyche adapts by pushing these unacceptable emotions out of awareness. It builds a personality that is socially acceptable, calm, pleasing, non-threatening. But underneath, the unacknowledged self is growing in silence. The rage that was never spoken turns into bitterness. The sadness that was never honored becomes apathy. The desire that was never explored mutates into resentment or obsession. Jung believed that anything pushed into the unconscious continues to influence us, just not in ways we can control. This is why suppression is so dangerous. Repressed emotions do not disappear, they manifest in indirect ways. Someone who never allows themselves to express anger might experience it through chronic irritability, sarcasm, or passive aggression. Another person who represses grief may find themselves feeling numb, disconnected, or restless without knowing why. When the psyche is denied expression, it finds other channels through the body, through symptoms, through relationships, or through unconscious habits that repeat over and over. We may develop physical illnesses, addictions, or anxieties that have no apparent cause, but that trace back to long-forgotten moments of emotional suppression. Jung emphasized that this kind of psychic split creates a divided self. There is the part of us that we consciously identify with the ego and the part we've exiled, which lives in the unconscious. The wider the gap between these two selves, the more tension builds. People often think they are stable because they don't feel extreme emotions. But Jung would say this is not stability, it is stagnation. The absence of feeling is not peace. It may be a sign of repression, a sign that the vital energy of the psyche has been locked away. And eventually, it will demand to be acknowledged. It may come out in a sudden outburst, a breakdown, a life crisis, or a series of failed relationships. Jung called this process enantiodromia, the phenomenon where an extreme one-sidedness inevitably turns into its opposite. When we suppress anger long enough, it turns into explosive rage. When we deny desire, it can turn into obsession. When we ignore pain, it becomes depression. The tragic irony is that many people believe they are doing the right thing by suppressing their darker emotions. They want to be good, moral, or spiritually pure, so they ignore their shadow. But this is not goodness, it is a form of self-abandonment. Jung believed that true morality requires awareness, not denial. To pretend we are beyond rage, envy, lust, or fear is to cut ourselves off from the full spectrum of our humanity. And when we disown these parts, they don't just go away, they control us in secret. They become the hidden motivations behind our behavior, influencing our choices, relationships, and worldview. We judge others harshly because we cannot face what they reflect back to us. We fear vulnerability in others because it reminds us of what we've buried within. We create narratives that keep us from seeing the truth that the chaos we try to avoid is already living inside us. Suppression also interferes with creativity and vitality. The same psychic energy used to repress anger could be used to fuel passion, courage, and authenticity. The energy required to hide grief could instead deepen empathy and connection. When we suppress parts of ourselves, we not only avoid pain, we also block joy, spontaneity, and the raw aliveness of being fully human. The shadow holds not only wounds, but gifts. And by repressing what we fear, we also bury what we need to thrive. This is why many people feel empty or unfulfilled despite outward success. They've crafted a perfect image, but their inner world is starved. They've followed the rules of acceptance, but they've lost access to their true desires. Jung proposed that healing begins with recognition, not intellectual analysis, but emotional honesty. We must learn to sit with what we feel, even when it is uncomfortable or socially frowned upon. This doesn't mean we act out every impulse or indulge every emotion. It means we stop pretending they're not there. We begin to listen to our inner life instead of silencing it. Anger may be telling us where our boundaries have been crossed. Grief may be pointing to what we've loved and lost. Envy may be revealing what we secretly desire. Every suppressed emotion carries a message. And until we listen, we will be ruled by signals we don't understand. The path to integration is not always linear. When repressed material begins to surface, it often does so in waves, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes subtle. It may come through dreams, sudden mood shifts, or an unexpected confrontation with someone who triggers a deep reaction. These moments are invitations. They are not signs of failure, they are signs that the psyche is trying to become whole again. But if we react with shame or denial, we push the shadow back down. We reinforce the cycle of repression and explosion, numbness and overreaction. Jung suggested instead that we approach the shadow with curiosity and compassion. We begin to ask, what have I not allowed myself to feel? What part of me has been in hiding? What am I afraid would happen if I faced this truth? This kind of inner inquiry is not for the faint of heart. It requires courage, patience, and sometimes support, but the reward is immense. As we bring repressed emotions into awareness, they lose their toxic grip. We gain access to our inner strength, intuition, and resilience. We become more grounded, less reactive, more able to respond to life with clarity rather than compulsion. We stop projecting our unresolved pain onto others and begin taking responsibility for our own healing. Jung did not promise that this work would be easy, but he believed it was essential. The alternative is to remain trapped in cycles of denial and sabotage, disconnected from the truth of who we are. The cost of suppression is the fragmentation of the self, and the price of integration is only the willingness to feel what we have long avoided. Carl Jung believed that the path to wholeness, the journey he called individuation, requires the integration of the shadow. This idea lies at the very heart of his depth psychology. Individuation is not simply becoming better, wiser, or more. Spiritual, it is becoming whole, and to be whole means to bring all parts of ourselves, including those we have denied or rejected, into the light of consciousness. The shadow is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be integrated. Until we learn to do this, we remain fragmented beings, identified with only the most acceptable parts of ourselves while projecting the rest onto others. Jung saw this split as the source of immense inner suffering, as well as the root of many of society's collective disorders. When we split off the shadow, we walk through life half-blind, mistaking our masks for our identity, and blaming others for the turmoil we carry within. The work of integration begins with recognition. We cannot integrate what we have not first acknowledged. This requires a level of self-honesty that many people are not prepared for, because it means admitting that we are not always who we pretend to be. It means seeing ourselves not only as victims of life but as participants in our own suffering. The process is not about condemning ourselves or wallowing in guilt. It is about seeing the complexity of the human experience with compassion and depth. We all have light and darkness within us. We all carry contradictions, and true psychological maturity begins when we stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be whole. To integrate the shadow, to recognize that it is part of us. It may contain traits that are difficult, painful, or even destructive, but it also contains energy, insight, and creative force. The same rage that can destroy a relationship can also fuel the courage to set boundaries. The same envy that breeds bitterness can also point to neglected desires. The same grief that feels overwhelming can lead us to deeper connection and compassion. Integration does not mean acting out these emotions recklessly, but neither does it mean denying them. It means making space for them, understanding where they come from, and learning how to work with them rather than against them. This work is deeply personal, but it is also profoundly relational. Our shadow often reveals itself in the context of others through conflict, projection, emotional triggers, and unmet expectations. When we find ourselves reacting intensely to someone, that moment contains the potential for growth. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with them?" we begin to ask, "What does this stir in me?" These moments, though uncomfortable, become portals to deeper self-awareness. They show us where the shadow still holds influence. They point to the places where we have not yet integrated our emotions, stories, or fears. Every emotional reaction is an opportunity to learn, not about others, but about ourselves. Jung emphasized that shadow integration is a lifelong process. It is not something we do once and complete. The unconscious is vast and layered, and new aspects of the shadow reveal themselves at different stages of life. As we grow, evolve, and encounter new challenges, the psyche invites us to meet deeper parts of ourselves. This is why the journey of individuation is not a straight path, but a spiral. We revisit old wounds with new awareness. We confront familiar patterns from a higher perspective. We learn to navigate the terrain of the unconscious with more grace and insight. Each time we bring a piece of the shadow into consciousness, we reclaim more of our own energy. We become more centered, more integrated, more fully alive. The integration of the shadow also allows for a more authentic sense of self. When we live only from our persona, the mask we wear to be accepted by society, we lose touch with our inner truth. The persona is not inherently bad. It is necessary for social interaction and survival. But when we become overly identified with it, we disconnect from the deeper layers of who we are. We start performing instead of living. We say what we think others want to hear. We do what is expected rather than what is true. The shadow disrupts this performance. It breaks through the facade, reminding us that there is more within us than we've allowed ourselves to express. Integration means that we stop hiding. We begin to live from a place of inner congruence, where our outer actions align more closely with our inner reality. This journey also fosters empathy and humility. When we confront our own shadow, we become less judgmental of others. We recognize that we, too, are capable of the things we criticize. we understand the complexity of the human condition not just in theory, but in practice. We see that behind every act of cruelty is often unprocessed pain. Behind every expression of arrogance is often deep insecurity. Behind every emotional outburst is often a story of abandonment or betrayal. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it deepens our understanding. It allows us to hold space for ourselves and others without collapsing into blame or shame. Integration creates a more compassionate world, one person at a time. There is also a mystical quality to this work. Jung believed that the shadow is not merely psychological, it is symbolic. In myths, dreams, and spiritual traditions, the shadow appears as the dragon, the underworld, the dark night of the soul. These symbols point to the inner journey that each person must undertake. They speak to the universal truth that transformation requires descent before ascent. We must go into the dark before we can find the light. The shadow, in this sense, is not an obstacle, it is the guardian of the treasure. It holds the key to our deepest wisdom, our soul's calling, our inner gold. But to receive these gifts, we must face what we fear. We must walk through the valley of our own psyche, not with judgment, but with reverence. Jung did not offer quick fixes or easy answers. His approach was profound because it was honest. He understood that real change comes not from suppressing the shadow, but from making it conscious. The work is not glamorous. It does not always feel good, but it is sacred. It is the work of becoming fully human. To integrate the shadow is to stop living in fragments. It is to gather the scattered pieces of ourselves and bring them home. It is to walk with integrity not because we are flawless, but because we are aware, and in that awareness, we find freedom. We begin to live from a place of inner unity, no longer at war with ourselves, no longer ruled by what we do not see. The shadow is not your enemy, it is your teacher, your mirror, your hidden self waiting to be known. Carl Jung's exploration of the human psyche led him to an extraordinary insight that facing the shadow does not only liberate us from suffering and fragmentation, but also awakens hidden potential and creativity. Most people think of the shadow as the place where all our darker impulses are stored, our rage, jealousy, fear, and shame. And while it certainly contains those things, Jung discovered that it also harbors repressed strengths, forgotten talents, and buried gifts. The shadow is not only the container for what we fear, but also for what we long for, but believe we are not allowed to express. It is not just the home of trauma, it is the vault of suppressed genius. Within it lie the seeds of everything we might become, if only we had the courage to look inward. From early childhood, individuals begin receiving messages about what is acceptable and what is not. Families, schools, and societies shape our sense of self by rewarding conformity and punishing deviation. We learn quickly that some emotions and abilities are welcome while others bring rejection. A child who is highly imaginative may be told to stop daydreaming and focus. A sensitive child may be labeled too emotional. A girl who speaks her mind may be seen as bossy, while a boy who cries may be told to toughen up. These judgments don't merely hurt, they divide the psyche. The child learns to hide certain aspects of themselves to gain love and approval. Over time, these hidden traits become part of the shadow, and what could have been a gift, creativity, empathy, assertiveness, emotional depth gets locked away. With the rest of the unacceptable parts of the self, the shadow does not judge what it holds. It only stores what we cannot face, and this includes not only our wounds, but our potential. Many people find that as they begin the work of shadow integration, they start to rediscover parts of themselves they thought were lost. A repressed love for music resurfaces, an old dream of writing or teaching returns. A forgotten desire to lead or create begins to stir. These long-buried passions did not disappear, they were simply hidden beneath layers of shame, fear, and conditioning. The process of shadow work is like an archaeological excavation. As we dig through the rubble of denial and repression, we find buried treasures. But we must be willing to face the dust and dirt of our past in order to recover the gold. This is why Jung often spoke of the shadow not only as something dark, but as something golden. He used the term the golden shadow to describe the positive traits we project onto others because we cannot yet accept them in ourselves. We admire someone's courage, brilliance, or charisma, not realizing that we are seeing our own potential reflected back at us. This kind of projection is often overlooked, but it is just as revealing as our negative projections. When we idolize someone, place them on a pedestal, or feel inexplicably drawn to them, it is often because they embody a part of us we have not yet claimed. Instead of merely admiring them, we can ask, what is it in them that lives dormant in me? Recovering these disowned parts requires facing fear. There is often a reason we push them into the shadow in the first place. Perhaps we were told we were not good enough. Perhaps we failed once and decided we were not meant to try again. Perhaps our power scared someone, and so we dimmed our light to make them comfortable. Whatever the story, it left a scar, and that scar created a barrier between us and our own potential. To reclaim it, we must be willing to walk through the discomfort, the self-doubt, the vulnerability that comes with awakening something we've long hidden. This is not a surface-level process. It is a confrontation with the parts of ourselves we left behind in order to survive. Creativity, in particular, often lives in the shadow. True creativity does not come from the intellect alone, it comes from the depths of the unconscious. It speaks in symbols, dreams, images, and impulses. When we repress our inner world, we block the flow of inspiration. We may feel numb, uninspired, or stuck, not because we lack talent, but because we have cut off access to the wellspring from which creative energy flows. Jung understood that engaging with the shadow could reignite this connection. He often encouraged his patients to draw, paint, or write as a means of communicating with the unconscious. Through these acts of expression, the shadow begins to speak not in words alone, but in emotion, intuition, and image. What once seemed chaotic becomes meaningful. What once felt dangerous becomes generative. Personal power is another aspect often hidden in the shadow. Many people fear their own strength because they associate it with domination or harm. They have seen power abused and believe that to be powerful is to be dangerous. But Jung taught that true power is not about control, it is about integration. When we deny our power, we become passive, resentful, or secretly manipulative. When we reclaim it, we become grounded, clear, and capable of setting boundaries without aggression. Shadow work helps us own this power by facing the fears we've attached to it. We begin to separate the distortions of power from its authentic form. We recognize that being powerful does not mean being cruel, it means being fully present, fully alive, and fully responsible for who we are. There is also a spiritual dimension to this recovery. Jung believed that the soul is not something perfect, waiting to be revealed, but something complex and evolving. The soul speaks through shadow as much as it does through light. When we ignore the shadow, we ignore half of the soul's language. But when we begin to integrate, we move into alignment with something deeper. Our life begins to feel more authentic, more purposeful. We stop chasing empty goals and start creating from a place of wholeness. We no longer seek validation from others because we are in conversation with the truth within. The shadow, once feared, becomes an Alaya guide leading us back to our center. The process of uncovering hidden potential is not always dramatic. Sometimes it happens in quiet moments of realization. A sudden urge to create, a memory that returns with warmth instead of shame. A decision to speak up where once we stayed silent. These are signs that the shadow is softening, that the self is expanding. The more we engage with this process, the more we trust it. We learn to see the signs, follow the impulses, and listen to the voice within. And in doing so, we move closer to the person we were always meant to become, not a perfect person, but a whole one. The person whose wounds have become wisdom, whose shame has become strength, whose silence has become song. The shadow is not simply where we store what is dark, it is where we keep what is powerful. And to face it is not to enter a battle, it is to begin a transformation. What we hide holds the key to our becoming, and the courage to look within is the beginning of awakening everything we once believed we had to leave behind. Carl Jung challenged the conventional moral view of the shadow as simply evil, immoral, or destructive. He understood the human psyche not as a battleground of good versus evil, but as a living, breathing complexity in which even the darker aspects of the self had value and necessity. The shadow, he insisted, is not evil in itself. What gives it power and often leads to destructive outcomes is our refusal to acknowledge and integrate it. When we label the shadow as evil and try to cast it out entirely, we create an inner split that breeds repression, hypocrisy, projection, and ultimately unconscious behavior. In Jung's view, the real danger is not the shadow itself, but the unconsciousness surrounding it. What is unconscious rules us. What we fear and suppress becomes what we act out in distorted ways. And what we deny in ourselves becomes what we attack in others. The misunderstanding of the shadow as evil stems from a moral framework that divides human impulses into black and white, good and bad, pure and impure. But Jung argued that the psyche does not operate this way. Emotions like anger, fear, desire, and sadness are not inherently bad, they are human responses to life. The problem arises when these emotions are not understood, processed, or expressed in healthy ways. Repressed anger becomes rage, repressed fear becomes paralysis, repressed desire becomes manipulation. The distortion comes not from the emotion itself, but from its concealment. In trying to be good, many people develop a false self, one that conforms to social norms while hiding their true feelings, impulses, and conflicts. This persona may be praised and accepted by society, but it comes at the cost of inner truth and psychological integrity. Jung observed that people who strive excessively to appear good often carry the most dangerous shadows, because they have disowned their anger, pride, lust, or ambition. These qualities operate unconsciously and find expression in covert or destructive ways. The overly nice person becomes passive-aggressive. The morally rigid person becomes judgmental. The spiritual seeker becomes narcissistic under the guise of enlightenment. These distortions are not failures of character, they are the consequences of denying the wholeness of the human experience. The path to integrity is not paved with moral perfection, but with psychological awareness. When we understand that the shadow is not evil, but misunderstood, we begin to approach it with curiosity instead of fear. This shift in perception opens a door. Instead of rejecting the shadow, we begin to listen to it. What is my anger trying to tell me? What fear lies beneath this defensiveness? What part of me feels unseen, unexpressed, or unloved? These questions allow us to dialogue with the shadow. We begin to see that it is not a monster, but a messenger. It carries stories, wounds, needs, and unmet truths. To integrate the shadow is not to indulge harmful behavior, it is to acknowledge the feelings and motives beneath that behavior and find healthier ways to express and work with them. When we bring the shadow into consciousness, we stop being controlled by it. We move from compulsion to choice, from reaction to reflection. This approach also humanizes us. We become less obsessed with appearing perfect and more committed to being honest. We accept that we are capable of both light and darkness, and that both are necessary for growth. Jung saw the shadow not as a flaw to fix, but as a part of the soul that longs to be seen. This is why shadow work is ultimately an act of self-compassion. It is about meeting the parts of ourselves we have abandoned not with shame, but with understanding. It is about reclaiming the energy we've wasted on denial and redirecting it toward authenticity. The shadow also contains instincts that are essential to our survival and wholeness. Our assertiveness, our need for boundaries, our capacity for desire and vitality, these are often suppressed in the name of being agreeable, spiritual, or polite. But when we repress our instincts, We become disconnected from the body and from life itself. We lose our capacity to say no, to claim space, to pursue what truly matters to us. Jung believed that the integration of the shadow restores our instinctual intelligence. It reconnects us with our animal nature, not in a savage or chaotic way, but in a grounded and embodied way. We begin to trust ourselves more deeply, to feel what is true rather than just think what is correct. On a collective level, this misunderstanding of the shadow plays out in dangerous ways. Entire societies project their unacknowledged traits onto other groups, racial, political, religious, or ideological. These projections fuel prejudice, conflict, and even genocide. When we fail to own our own aggression, we see enemies everywhere. When we deny our own capacity for control, we accuse others of tyranny. When we disown our own darkness, we become blind to our own cruelty. Jung warned that collective shadow projection was one of the greatest threats to humanity. He lived through 2 world wars and saw firsthand what happens when unconscious forces dominate the human mind. For him, the work of shadow integration was not just personal, it was essential for the survival of civilization. This is why Jung did not call for moral purity, but for moral consciousness. He believed that ethics must be rooted in awareness, not in denial. A person who sees their own shadow is less likely to act out destructively. They can hold tension, navigate complexity, and make choices with humility. They do not need to pretend to be flawless, because they know that being human is not about being perfect, it is about being whole. This wholeness includes the capacity to acknowledge mistakes, take responsibility, and grow through imperfection. It includes the courage to see ourselves as we are, not just as we wish to be. The spiritual traditions that Jung admired, particularly those from the East, often spoke of integrating opposites, light and dark, yin and yang, form and emptiness. He believed that psychological health involved this same principle. We cannot eliminate the shadow. We can only become aware of it, relate to it, and work with it in a conscious way. The more we do this, the less we fear ourselves, the less we fear others, the less we need to pretend. In this space of honesty, something extraordinary happens. We begin to feel at home in our own skin. We begin to experience a deeper sense of self, not a self that is edited for approval, but one that is rooted in the truth of our inner world. This kind of self-knowledge does not make us weaker, it makes us stronger. Not in the sense of dominance or control, but in the sense of resilience and inner peace. We can navigate challenges with more grace because we are no longer fighting parts of ourselves. We can connect more deeply with others because we no longer project our disowned traits onto them. We can live more fully because we are not wasting energy on pretending. The shadow, when misunderstood, becomes a prison, but when embraced, it becomes a portal to authenticity, to creativity, and to the deepest forms of human connection. Carl Jung taught that the first step towards self-awareness begins not with ambition or willpower, but with the willingness to confront what lies beneath the surface of consciousness. One of his most enduring insights was that the shadow, the hidden, repressed part of the self, does not dissolve through avoidance or denial. It is only through bringing what is unconscious into the light of awareness that we begin to reclaim our wholeness. Jung's famous statement, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," underscores the truth that the parts of ourselves we refuse to see will quietly shape our behavior, our choices, our relationships, and our reality. The longer we keep the unconscious unconscious, the more power it has over us. But when we start to turn inward and examine what we have denied, buried, or judged within ourselves, the shadow begins to lose its grip, and we begin to step into conscious living. Self-awareness demands courage. It is far easier to live in projection, to blame others for our pain, to see the world through the lens of victimhood, or to maintain the illusion of being morally superior. It is more comfortable to wear a mask, to cling to certainty, to surround ourselves with like-minded people who affirm our version of truth. But Jung warned that comfort is not the same as growth. The moment we begin to examine our inner world, we uncover discomfort, contradiction, and complexity. We discover that we are not as innocent or as enlightened as we may have thought. We realize that our judgments about others often mirror unacknowledged aspects of ourselves. We find that what irritates us in others often points to something unresolved within. This kind of realization is not flattering to the ego, but it is liberating to the soul. The shadow reveals itself most often in our emotional reactivity. When something provokes a strong, seemingly disproportionate response, it is often a sign that our unconscious has been touched. Perhaps someone disrespects us and we erupt with anger not because of their words alone, but because that moment activates a deeper wound, a time when we felt invisible, unheard, or humiliated. Or perhaps someone receives praise and we feel resentment not because they don't deserve it, but because we have buried our own desire for recognition. Every emotional trigger contains a message. But instead of listening to the message, we often act out the emotion or suppress it. In doing so, we miss the opportunity for insight. Jung encouraged us to pause in those moments and ask, what is this really about? What part of me is trying to speak right now? Making the unconscious conscious is not an event, it is a lifelong process. The unconscious is not a container we can empty and be done with. It is a dynamic realm that continues to evolve as we do. As we grow in awareness, deeper layers of the shadow emerge. At each stage of life, we are invited to confront new truths, shed outdated identities, and integrate fresh insights. This is the path of individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, beyond the roles, masks, and expectations imposed upon us. Individuation does not promise comfort, but it does offer authenticity. It requires us to surrender illusions of perfection and embrace the fullness of our humanity. This journey can be disorienting at times. As we bring unconscious material to light, we may experience resistance, shame, confusion, or even grief. We may grieve the person we thought we were, the narratives we've clung to, the masks we've worn. We may feel uncertain about who we are without them. But this is not regression, it is transformation. Jung believed that psychological healing involves going through the darkness, not avoiding it. Like the mythological descent into the underworld, shadow work leads us into the depths of the psyche, where we encounter the parts of ourselves we've exiled. And just like in those ancient myths, the descent is not the end. It is the necessary step before rebirth. One of the gifts of making the unconscious conscious is that we begin to reclaim our agency. When we live from the unconscious, we are reactive. We repeat patterns without knowing why. We sabotage relationships, cling to addictions, chase external validation, and wonder why we feel empty. But as we bring those patterns into awareness, we begin to make different choices. We recognize the wound beneath the reaction. We identify the belief behind the behavior. We respond rather than react. We begin to move through the world with greater intention and clarity. This does not mean we become flawless or immune to emotion. It means we become more present to what is driving us, and therefore more empowered to choose how we want to respond. Jung's view of the unconscious was not limited to the personal. He spoke of the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that connects us to the shared human experience. This realm contains archetypes, universal patterns, and themes that show up in myths, dreams, and spiritual traditions. These archetypes also shape the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress. Not merely personal, they are often shaped by cultural narratives, historical trauma, and ancestral patterns. As we work to make the unconscious conscious, we may find ourselves healing not only our own wounds, but also breaking cycles that have persisted for generations. The journey of self-awareness becomes a sacred task, one that contributes not only to personal healing, but to collective evolution. Dreams often play a central role in this process. Jung saw dreams as direct messages from the unconscious. They speak in symbols, metaphors, and images that bypass the rational mind. In dreams, The shadow may appear as a threatening figure, a lost child, a wild animal, or even an unknown stranger. These dream characters are not to be feared. They are aspects of ourselves calling for recognition. When we engage with our dreams, reflect on their symbolism, and explore their meaning, we deepen our relationship with the unconscious. We learn to listen to the soul's language, and we begin to see how our inner world is always speaking, always guiding, always inviting us toward wholeness. Another important aspect of bringing the unconscious to light is developing the capacity for self-reflection. This is more than simply thinking about our behavior. It involves cultivating an inner observer, a part of the psyche that can witness thoughts, feelings, and actions without immediate judgment or defense. This observer allows us to step back and ask, why did I say that? What belief was I operating from? What fear was beneath that choice? This kind of reflection requires honesty, patience, and humility. It is not about self-criticism, it is about self-understanding. The more we practice it, the more we develop psychological insight. We begin to see the threads that connect past and present, cause and effect, shadow and self. Relationships also become laboratories for self-awareness. The people closest to us often serve as mirrors, reflecting back parts of ourselves we might not see on our own. Conflict, attraction, disappointment, and admiration, all of these experiences in it hold clues to the unconscious. Instead of blaming others or idolizing them, we begin to ask, what is this relationship teaching me about myself? We recognize that every connection is an opportunity to grow in awareness, to see more clearly, and to love more deeply, starting with ourselves. Jung's work reminds us that the unconscious is not the enemy. It is not something to conquer or eliminate. It is a dimension of the self that holds wisdom, potential, and depth. When we engage with it, we awaken parts of ourselves that have been sleeping. We uncover truths we were not ready to see before. We begin to live not as fragments, but as integrated beings. The journey is not always easy, but it is deeply meaningful. It is the path of becoming real, of living with eyes open, and of embracing the mystery and fullness of what it means to be human.